Hello, everyone. Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the podcast. But yeah, I'm literally sitting in the dog bed over on the other side of the bedroom right now because are you taking a picture of me, Gabby?
Absolutely, I am. Guys, I'm going to post it to Instagram. This is absolutely ridiculous. And I love it. The dog bed.
The dog, it's comfortable.
Now the dog's going to know that he's above you. I mean, he is, but now he's going to know.
Okay, yeah, how many times does he sleep directly on your pillow?
On your pillow.
No. He lays his whole body across, and you know where most of his hair comes off of?
On my side of the bed.
Yes,
yeah.
because his butt is over there. His butt. Yeah. When you pet a dog, you start from the head, you move down. Therefore, all the loose hair gathers around the lower part of the back, and that's why it's on your side of the bed.
Anyway, guys, before we get into today's episode, we would love if you guys would leave us some reviews of the podcast. It really helps the podcast get promoted in the algorithms, and it also lets us know what you like. In addition, Germany, we only have 3 early bird spots left. We did not expect it to book that quickly. Like, typically, it takes a while for people to book it. But yeah, if you want to join us and get a $200 discount, make sure to sign up as soon as possible. On top of that, Peru, we have, I think, 7 spots left to Peru. If you want to join us for that one.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're looking to have an adventure, by all means, join us because it's going to be a ton of fun. And I can't wait to meet all of you there.
And hopefully one day we can get Steven a chair so he's not sitting on the dog bed.
We have had chairs in here before. Okay, we have. But
they're too big. Our house isn't that big.
Oh,
but anyway,
into
today's episode, which we are taking a break from Ibn Battuta. We will have the 3rd part coming out next week, but we thought we would break it up, switch it up before people get bored.
Yeah, because we usually end up doing things where it's like, I still remember when we did the Crusades episode, and that thing took, again, 8 or 9 episodes, and that was too much.
And typically people, the average listener of our podcast, at least what we've noticed from analytics, you guys tend to, I don't know if you're waiting for all parts to release or what, but the listens drop off on by the 3rd part. So
yeah. And also, it's just not something that, especially when posting to YouTube, that people really necessarily care about as much with it. So we got to be able to add in and mix some stuff up.
Yep.
Which, if we're going to be mixing things in and making something spicy, do you know what's very spicy, Gabby?
War crimes.
War crimes.
And I forced him to do this. I actually had to research the first part of it because he was dying of bronchitis as usual. When is he not?
Which, you know, that all being considered, that's a war crime that has also been done in the past, is, you know, using plague on people. I'm pretty sure that's something that we mentioned in there, like the Mongols at Kaffa.
I didn't write that, so unless you did.
Yeah. Technically speaking, that wasn't chemical warfare. That was launching diseased bodies and livestock.
Biological warfare.
Yeah, that'd just be biological warfare. Which, on that note, this is a mix thing. Like, we say war crimes, but the total of the episode is that it's about the Geneva Convention, which we know the Geneva Conventions are the things that people are not supposed to be doing in war. They're not supposed to be violating things.
But when it comes to war crimes, if you guys want a war crime specific episode, Weirdest War Crimes is a podcast episode that one of our researchers is currently working on. That will be coming out in the next few weeks. I'm so excited for what they come up with.
Yeah, the other one we could possibly do in that is biggest war crimes. Like there's a lot of different ones that you could do, and that would get really dark really quick considering what we're talking about. I could basically just talk about the entirety of the Japanese in World War II. All of it. Like literally all of it.
The Canadians, though, didn't they? They contributed a lot.
They did, but if you want to compare the Canadians to what the Japanese did, especially just for the general Chinese population, I mean, we're talking about they referred to people like from their biological testing where they would cut people open while they were still alive while testing modified versions of anthrax and bubonic plague on them so that they could watch what was happening to their organs with no anesthetic while they were still alive.
Who did they do these tests on?
Just Chinese villagers.
Oh.
Prisoners of war. Anyone that they captured.
Well.
They referred to them as murata. Do you know what that means?
Something about death.
Logs. Because they weren't people anymore. They were ordering logs to be cut. Yeah,
I don't know what to say here.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, that's just an example. So while that is something that we could definitely do, in this case, I wanted to talk about not only the Geneva Conventions, but a history of arms control and treaties, like the things that have been done to try and limit war effectively over time, which is a really fascinating story in itself, right? Because the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, these are the core of international humanitarian law, like specific international laws that will regulate armed conflict, or at least, when that's possible, when it's actually applicable. And it is something that seeks to limit its effects, though, again, not always very successful. These are specifically designed to protect people who are not taking part in conflicts, that being civilians, health workers, aid workers, as well as those who were initially in the conflict but are no longer participating in the hostilities, such as a person who has been wounded, who is sick, a shipwrecked soldier, a prisoner of war, something like that. The conventions and the protocols specifically call for measures to be taken to prevent or put an end to all breaches. They contain stringent rules to deal with what are known as grave breaches, and those responsible for grave breaches must be sought, tried, or extradited, whatever nationality they may hold. At least, again, that is what is supposed to happen. But in reality, that's not always the case. And in war, things tend to get very, very murky. Go figure. So before we go and get into the actual conventions of like the Geneva Conventions and whatnot, I figured that what we should do is we should go into the history of arms treaties and when people tried to control war before modern tech and ideas, which, the whole thing is just the history of arms controls. And at this point, I'm going to go into a lot of things in order that we're going to need to elaborate upon these with time. Gabby, do you want to start us off here with the Greeks? Something that we did chemical warfare specifically as a patron exclusive episode, and we talked about this specific war in that. But that was just a singular part. You can probably guess why after this war, they wanted to limit what was done.
Oh, yeah. So back in the 7th century BC, the Greek city-states, they jointly agreed within the how would I say that? Amphictonic. See, I was trying to figure it out because I was like, there's a Y in there. Anyway, the Amphictonic League to protect the temples of Demeter at the Anthela and Apollo at Delphi. This Amphictonic League was also called the League of Neighbors, but it was originally made between Greek tribes. But even as these tribes developed into more established city-states, they somehow decided to stick with their agreement. The 12 tribes that formed this league were the Aenians, the Otanians, the Boeotians of Thebes, the Dolopes, the Dorians of Sparta, the Ionians of Athens, the Phthian Achaeans, the Locrians, the Opuntians, and the Ozolians.
A lot of names. There's a lot of names with this.
Basically, he made me read this, and there were a lot more like the Thessalians, but these tribes, they all managed to agree that in the event of war, cities should not be cut off from their water supplies or completely destroyed, which I guess makes a lot of sense because without their water, everyone would die. And no one group was allowed to be completely wiped out during a war, which I guess is also really nice of them.
Okay, guys. Okay. No genocide. Come on, guys. Come on. Let's just chill. No genocide, please.
They're like, you can kill us, but you got to leave some of us. Okay? And I like that they agreed to that. Anyway, this league stayed intact even through 4 sacred wars and a 10-year war between the Phocians and the Macedonians. And it didn't decline until sometime during the 2nd century AD, when it was then replaced by the Panhellean, which was created by Hadrian. So the idea of the Amphictonic League, however, it stayed strong even after its decline, because it was able to show that countries, tribes, cities, and republics were able to have, quote unquote, permanent alliances and hold each other to a common law, even during times of war.
There's a very key reason why I even had to mention to put this in here in the first place. Remember when we covered the chemical warfare episode? And it's like one of the first cases, like the first documented case of chemical warfare that we have is specifically with this league, right? And what happened in that, for anyone who is not a patron who wants to go check that out, $1 a month, patron episodes, just go ahead and check it out. Anyway, is that in a siege of one of these cities, they cut off the city from water because they found the underground water pipe that was supplying the city with water. And after cutting it off for a couple days and letting that water dry out and letting the city suffer, they then allowed the water to flow again, but this time they poisoned it with hellebore, which is a very toxic plant. And in doing so, the city, which had been suffering from lack of water, drank it and then proceeded to shit themselves either to death or to incapacitation and was then easily overtaken.
So that's why they put it in there specifically that you can't mess with the water.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Also, sorry about the pronunciation of all those tribes, guys. I did give up halfway. I will say that.
Gabby, I don't think anything that you did is as much of a war crime as when I tried to pronounce anything from any of the French episodes.
Epitome.
Don't remind me about that moment, please.
It's because you're a reader. Sometimes, like, there was this word I can't even remember it, like geographic.
Geographic.
I cannot say that word because when I was a kid, I would say geographic in my head.
Oh my God! So it's the same thing as you and me with epitome and saying epitome in my head.
Yeah, there's a lot of words like papyrus. I say papyrus because I used to say papyrus in my head. So now every time I have to say the word papyrus scrolls, it's a whole thought.
See, okay, for anyone who's wondering about the context of the story, there was a very embarrassing thing that I had for years, and that was literally until college, right? Because I read so much as a kid, and I knew the word epitome, right? And I thought it was spelled differently. And so I thought that a similar word was epitome, right? Because I would read this thing that I had never heard anyone say in any of my classes, in any program, in anything, never on TV, nothing.
So we are literally at dinner with his college best friend and roommate's mom. And he's like, oh yeah, it's the epitome. So like his best friend and I are like, you mean epitome? And he's like, no, that's like another similar word. It's not this word. And we're like, okay. And he's like, anyway, the epitome. And we're like, we're telling you it's epitome. And he's like, what do you mean? So we were like, okay, whatever. We're going to leave him. He'll use this word 50 times this dinner. But then when we're like walking out of the dinner, we're like, so that word that you were trying to say, is it this word? And we show him the word and he's like, yeah, epitome. And we're like, so that is pronounced epitome.
It was easily one of the most embarrassing moments that I have ever had in my life. So if you want to critique me for pronunciation, you will have never seen me at my lowest point already. I'm telling you that right now. Anyway, okay, so let's fast forward a little further in time to the 8th and 9th century AD, right? Because all this was happening was in, it happened well before the modern era, so to speak. Well, while this next part doesn't exactly go over a specific alliance or set of rules that all countries must follow, it does go over very specific efforts to curb the flow of weapons of war, which is a very interesting point. And no, we're not talking crossbows. That's going to be a whole other section that's going to be after this. Specifically, weapons like swords and armor like chainmail. There is a famous case that the swords and chainmail that were manufactured in the Frankish Empire were of amazing quality historically. These were highly desirable trade goods. And the Franks held them in such high regard that they didn't even give these away as gifts. When they did give away things, there was even records that they would give other people stuff that they had gotten away as gifts. They would not give away their own. Frankish royals would specifically gift foreign swords in gift exchanges, but their own swords were always kept. Although at first, Frankish arms and armor were exported, and we know this because of the writings of the monk of St. Gall that spoke of Vikings arriving to purchase Frankish weapons in the court of Louis the German. But as time went on and Vikings and other forces became more hostile and would raid, restrictions ended up being placed on trade by Carolingian rulers. These laws were developed in the hopes of preventing their superior weapons from getting into the hands of their enemies. So it wasn't anything of like, oh, we want to stop conflict. It's okay, guys, we're making weapons. We don't want to sell the people that are trying to kill us weapons.
You'll see later on when we speak of armor, they were like, ooh, we want to be heavily armored. We don't want them to be heavily armored.
Exactly. So in fact, in 864 AD, we saw Charles the Bald making trading weapons to the Vikings punishable by death, which is very severe for that. In addition, in 869 AD, in the Annals of Bertiani, we see an event where Carolingian swords were included as part of the ransom for the Archbishop Rotland of Arles, which was a very smart way to obtain weapons, seeing as there were, an export ban in place. Even if you got gold or something for as a hostage exchange, like an exchange for as a ransom.
You can get gold anywhere, but some Frankish weapons, man.
Yeah. They didn't have medieval Amazon, you couldn't just order that here. It wasn't a thing that you could do.
It would be the medieval black market. So in my head, since I was a child, I always thought the black market was like this seedy joint that you would go purchase stuff in,
Sometimes it was in some cities, yeah.
But I guess in olden days, it literally was. You'd have to go to some back alley in some hut with some guy
You have to meet a contact. Sometimes the trade would happen in woods on the docks. One of the most common cases for a black market was that it would never take place on land. There were many different cases where you would have to sail out onto the ocean, make an exchange there, and then come back because there weren't guards on the ocean.
That sounds more inconvenient than Amazon, I will say.
Yeah,
just slightly more.
They had to do what they had to do to get the goods in. That's exactly what needed to be done. We still have record in the Capitulary of Boulogne that states, and I quote, "It has been decreed that no bishop or abbot or abbess or any rector or custodian of a church is to presume to give or to sell a brunia or a sword to any outsider without our permission. He may bestow these only on his own vassals. And should it happen that there are more bruniae in a particular church or holy place than there are needed for the people of said church's rector, then let the said rector of the church inquire of the prince what ought to be done concerning them." Brunia, in this case, for anyone who is not aware, this is it's armor. It's a
chainmail shirt.
Yes, it's a chainmail shirt.
It explains that on the next slide.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So the armor that was banned from export included the brunia, which are chainmail shirts, and the bernier and baguet, which were the arm guards. The armor ban came from rulers like Charlemagne not wanting their men to face a force that was also heavily armored. Because actually at the time, Charlemagne, it's very interesting here. This is the point in which the idea of the European knight starts. These are the very early days. Because at this time, this region in Europe, like Western Europe, was largely dominated by heavy infantry. That had always been the case, going back even to the days of ancient Rome. Like that was the case. But Charlemagne would utilize specifically his Frankish cavalry and knights in order to fight. And they were heavily armored, well equipped, well, at least for the time. They would get way better as time would go on, but they were still very good.
This is related slightly. Knights. You know how we have the picture of the knight in this heavy plate armor?
Yes.
I feel like, wouldn't that be inefficient as a cavalry? Because you typically wanted fast moving, but these guys were so heavily armored, there's no way they could be fast. Like, you fall off your horse in some armor, you're going to be lying on the floor. Horse is gone.
Great question. And that is because there was different type of cavalry. You have 3 classifications with subdivisions between: light, medium, and heavy. Though most people associate it as only light and heavy, medium is something that usually became more common associated in later time periods with, muskets and everything here where you'd have a blend. But
sorry, do you have an example of these types from Lord of the Rings? Because I feel like most people could picture Lord of the Rings.
Okay, so a hybrid example is that the Rohirrim would count as medium cavalry.
Okay.
They would. Because they were, while they did have good armor and everything, their horses were not armored. They didn't really have much protection on them. And they simultaneously, instead of being equipped with heavy lances and heavy shields and things like that, they had their lances, yes, but they also utilized bows. They were a more mobile cavalry that was heavily armored, more heavily armored. So they were medium cavalry, if anything. The Knights of Gondor were more, considering their armor and everything that they were equipped with, more in line with shock cavalry. But even then, they weren't very heavily armored. They still would be a heavy cavalry.
So heavy cavalry would be heavily armored knight, heavily armored horse.
Yes. And because this is where you would distinguish something between melee cavalry and shock cavalry. Though most commonly in any kind of warfare, you think of cavalry for shock. The whole point of shock is that it is a sudden, immediate, heavy hit that shocks the enemy, does a lot of damage, but it does not stay there.
It can't. They'd easily be knocked off their horse. It's game over.
Correct. So what would typically happen is that, remember, has the whole idea of hammer and anvil, that you'd have the infantry holding the enemy in place. The knights would go around as the hammer and hit them from behind. After you hit the enemy from behind, you don't just sit there and continuously fight from horseback. You can, but the longer that you are in that position, the more likely that you are to be pulled off your horse and overwhelmed. So what would typically happen is that the cavalry would hit, they would fight, then they would wheel, go back, go for another charge, hit from another spot.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And so that's what they would have to do. The worst example of any kind of cavalry that you could have are chariots. Because chariots were great in early stages of warfare where everyone was kind of spread out, there weren't all that many men, and it was flat, open terrain in like the desert and other stuff. But chariots fucking suck.
Oh, yeah, your wheel breaks. Now you got to undo the chariot from your horse if you want to move, but there was no saddle.
The horses at the time also were smaller, way smaller. So when they would hit the enemy, they didn't have nearly as much force. They weren't as well trained for war horses, so they couldn't really handle the fear and stuff that would happen in battle. They weren't nearly as fast. They were way more unwieldy, and they just didn't do as much damage when you hit something. Chariots actually sucked.
I would love to talk to someone who has like an expert idea on how to train a warhorse. That would be such a fun interview. I don't know who would even have that knowledge.
Oh, that's a great question. There are still cavalry forces that exist. So part of royal guards and stuff.
If anyone listening right now has any experience with cavalry, training like war horses, training a cavalry horse, please reach out, email us, because I would love to have you on the podcast.
That would sound like a lot of fun. Okay, so that is going into armor and whatnot. Wait, where were we? We're talking about Charlemagne.
Yeah,
right.
Charlemagne, he didn't want his force to face a heavily armored force because it's easier to win a fight against your enemy if they're lightly armored.
Correct. Okay. So interestingly enough, though, with these restrictions on trade preventing foreigners from obtaining these weapons and armor, groups like the Vikings would simply start obtaining them through raiding, because you don't need to necessarily trade with merchants when if you attack a fort or something where, you know, the enemy is located, you take them by surprise, you seize the armory. You take what you want anyway, just like that. And this is a thing that would be taken back as treasures.
So I didn't include it here, but there was one example of a guy, he started raiding with his force, a little Viking group, and it was like 200 something men, and they all ended up getting decked out just from like the continuous raiding.
Yeah, you could get very wealthy through the act of raiding. Like you really could. Why?
Well, they wanted the armor. He wanted an armored force. So like they were raiding and just like grabbing the gear.
Yeah.
Like literally looter shooter without the shoot part.
And for anyone who's there wondering, was like, why would you do that and not get a bunch of gold? In many cases, armor was quite literally worth its weight in gold, because you have to think about something being handmade. If you wanted to buy a suit of armor now, that is expensive.
I buy LARP armor, and let me tell you, it's a money sink. I am sinking a ton of money to look fabulous.
There is a reason why nobility and all these people were really the only ones that could afford good quality armor, because the amount of wealth that it would take, I mean, we're talking, depending upon the suit of what you would get, could be taking a regular person's wages or labor, years worth of that for a single suit. That's it.
I would be a little bit crazy, and I'd be the guy who just like signs up for the military just for the like state-sponsored suit of armor, and then I'd like quit my job like a few years in.
Oh my God, no, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Why?
Like
do they make you give it back?
Yes.
Even back then, employers were the worst. If I fought in this specific suit and I bled in it, it's mine.
Okay, you were allowed. Okay, if I remember correctly, you were not allowed to keep your armor, but there were many cases where soldiers were allowed to retire with their swords, like in the case of Rome.
They would even want the sword back. This is...
I actually don't remember what the specific rules, but I'm pretty sure you were allowed to retire with your sword, or you were allowed to buy your sword.
This is terrible. It's like when I found out that in the NFL, you have to buy your uniform and your helmet. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
I mean, to be fair, they can afford it.
I mean, yeah, but what? Why? You're sweating in that. The guy after you who has to use it is like, ew.
Oh my God. I remember there was the story here. What is it? And I know this is going to be going completely off the side because it's not even armor or anything, but it's the suit. Ryan Reynolds. He stole the suit from Deadpool. Because when
the actors don't get to keep, I mean, that one makes sense.
They give him back. But when they finished filming, instead of him giving back to costume and whatnot, he just walked off stage with it and took it.
That's smart. See, that's what the soldiers need to do. They can't stop all of them. They're literally the soldiers.
That's what you would call at that point a rebellion. And that usually ends up getting put down. Yes.
Who's putting it down? The soldiers?
Okay, listen, you don't want... Okay, this is going to sound so dumb here. And I know we're getting off topic for this, but it's important to address. So when you would have soldiers, they just left with their armor and weapons and other kinds of things, you're talking about civilians at that point having weapons and armor. something that the state typically does not want to happen because it increases the likelihood that those civilians are able to resist them. You don't want the peasants you're ruling over to be able to fight back.
It's so funny because we're about to get into essentially the medieval period's version of gun laws. So
yeah, true. So, okay. Another interesting then, as you just said, with the whole medieval version of gun laws or whatnot, is the history of the peace and truce of God, which is a fascinating point with all these little nuances in it. But basically the idea of it is that it is a middle-age movement that tried to limit the amount of time that people could engage in violent acts, so to speak. There was a religious movement that attempted to limit the nobility in how much warfare they were allowed to wage on one another, which, mind you, that's a thing that confuses a number of people. If you were part of the same kingdom, you were oftentimes still fighting people within your own kingdom from like your own petty familial and territorial disputes. France was rife with this. It was the perfect stage of what you describe as feudalism because the king of France only controlled Paris and a little bit of the surrounding territory. Everything else was controlled by nobles that were constantly fighting one another for power and influence. So there was miniature wars always going on in the medieval countryside, even within the same country.
That sounds like a very stable system of government.
Oh God, no, it was not. So during the 10th century, this movement started in France. Can you guess why? And then spread throughout Western Europe. It was decreed at the Synod of, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Therain in 1063, and then spread to southern Italy in 1089. It was introduced in Germany in 1082 by the Bishop of Liege, and 3 years later, Emperor Henry IV would extend it to the entire empire. Basically, at this time, many nobles would do whatever the hell they actually wanted. There were laws, but this wasn't really anything that would actually affect them because there wasn't any way to enforce them on nobles because nobles had their own armies and they could basically wreak as much havoc as they wanted on one another with no reprisals whatsoever. It also didn't matter if that person that they attacked also had an army to defend themselves with or not. They would just do whatever.
It wasn't really an honor. It was more of a fuck you.
Oh, no, pretty much. For whether it was power, territory, influence, perceived honor, whatever, they would just fight. So as you can imagine, the movement was based on frustration of these conditions. That's actually one of the interesting points as well. We're talking about this religious limitation now. That is one of the key reasons why the First Crusade happened in the first place, is that the Pope was trying to stop all the nobles from fighting each other and direct them towards a common cause.
I get into that later on too. Yep. Guys, I wrote this, so he doesn't know what's in here, but I was connecting all of these dots because it was all connected. It was so fun to write.
I told you.
So interesting thing, as you go further in, the church gets involved. I mean, obviously this was like a church-led movement, but apparently they would even attack clergy. Like they did not care.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially in the early days, there was a whole bunch of stuff like Charlemagne. Remember how we talked about that? He may have supported the church. He may have worked with the church. The church may have needed him. Simultaneously, he could bully the church into doing whatever it is that he wanted. He seized a lot of church territory because the way that church inheritance laws worked in the beginning was very messy. Like it always was really messy. But the problem that they were having was that the church was inheriting stupid amounts of land that, like from people donating it or getting it from people passing it down to their sons and then it going to the church. And the problem was that the land that was going to the church was not being taxed. So every single year, more and more and more land was being swallowed up by the church that was not paying taxes to the state. And that created a problem.
Yeah, that would be. So it's interesting because like 300 years later is where War of the Barons was set, right? And then in the LARP, for the purposes of LARP, you couldn't harm the church. But I'm assuming in real life too, you couldn't harm the church. You weren't supposed to,
yes. And a lot of bad things would happen if you did. But people still did it anyway.
Like
at
you'll
points.
Be smitten, smited by God.
Yeah, smote.
Smote.
You'll be
okay. This is the exact same problem we had at War of the Barons. You're like,
smite?
You're gonna be smited,
smittied.
My God.
I was just gonna call. You've been smittied. Smittied and sneed. Yes, indeed. So That's essentially what would happen, right? And the movement that would arise out of these religious gatherings that would end up occurring, these were held in open fields. And at these gatherings, different relics of the saints would be displayed, and followers would gather to see any miracles that may happen due to the relics being there. And at these gatherings, nobles and religious leaders would recite the laws of the state that regulated violence and protected non-combatants during battles. They would then have any soldiers present swear to follow the law. And what this Peace of God movement stated was that soldiers were not allowed to bring harm to the church members. They weren't allowed to destroy religious places. They weren't allowed to fight on Sundays or on feast days. And if someone was to break these rules, they faced potential excommunication. Later on, the Truce of God would expand on the Peace of God, and the Truce of God would specifically regulate when fighting was allowed. So the Council of Toulouse in 1027, this would ban fighting from Saturday evening to Monday morning. Then this was also expanded to include Thursday and Friday and Saturday, the seasons of Lent and the Advent, the holy days that would occur during the week, and eventually the Council of Clermont would not only set more stringent rules in place for the truce, but a few years later, with the call for the Crusades, the nobles would fight a common enemy instead of each other, and so they would be able to take care of it that way. I found a copy of Pope Urban II's speech, and I would recommend reading that entire thing because I would put that in here, but that would be roughly half the podcast, and that would be utter insanity.
I do have it linked in the sources, so if you guys want to read it, just email me and I can send it out. Or if you're on Patreon, I'll include like the references on the post.
But it's just really funny. It reached to the point because you know how over time, like within church history, I'm not sure if they covered this when you went to your school, since you went to a religious school initially. But there was a set number of feast days and things that occurred, right? And over time, they just kept on adding more as more things would happen or occur, or they would discover or make new holidays. So over time, like you're only supposed to fight on these certain days. And then those days would get further reduced as time went on because they would just keep on adding more feast days.
You know, they could have shut down all fighting by just saying, and now the Lord has blessed this age, the age of now. No fighting at all because we are in a blessed time. Praise be.
They would make attempts. Do you want to go into the 12th century then, Gabby?
Okay, so moving on, in the 12th century, we see the Second Lateran Council, which was a council summoned by Pope Innocent II in 1139. This council was meant to resolve the schism in the church, which was caused by the election of a rival pope, Anacletus II. And honestly, this council did a lot more, but for the purposes of this episode, the most important thing that they did was make canon the rule, and I quote, "We prohibit under anathema," which is excommunication, "that murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians and Catholics from now on."
Hateful to God.
Well, interestingly enough, Pope Urban II, that guy from earlier with the Crusades, he also attempted to ban the use of the crossbow after nobles of Western Europe pressured him to do so because of how brutal it was. However, his ban ended up not doing much because merchants still made and sold crossbows. So like he banned people using them, but he didn't ban the sale of them. So that was a minor oversight.
If I recall correctly, and I may be completely wrong on this, is that it was supposed to be banned for use in war, but it was still a very popular tool to be used for hunting.
Interesting.
So you just took your hunting crossbow and you went and fought a dude. Oh, no, it was just a hunting crossbow. I didn't mean to do this. What? No.
Also, guys, I was so excited to tell Steve about this next line here. I was like, it didn't help that Richard the Lionhearted of England was an expert with the crossbow, and that boosted his popularity. And then he goes, oh, yeah, it was ironic because he was also killed by a crossbow.
Yeah.
My research didn't mention that, okay?
Yeah,
obviously,
he got shot in the neck by a kid while sieging down a castle in France.
Why did the kid have the kid was fighting?
Yeah. I mean, it was a youth is what it was described as. So I think it could be at anywhere between the ages of like 12 and 16, essentially. But it was just a kid on a castle wall who shot him. At least that's how the story goes. And on his deathbed, he asked, because the wound became infected, and he asked for the kid to come down, essentially, so that he could give him a bag of gold and whatnot, and also like for being able to kill him is like a big deed. And also told his advisors and generals there to not punish him because, I mean, it was an honorable thing he did, like whatever. It was an act of valor on the battlefield. And immediately after Richard died, they did not do that. If I recall correctly, they had him tortured and killed.
That's not even fair. All's fair in love and war. That's like the basis of warfare, right? I think.
Yeah.
Sun Tzu. Whatever happened on the battlefield stays on the battlefield. I have to stop making up stuff and saying Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu says.
I'm sorry. That's I do that around the house all the time. I'll like say this random quote about battles and I'll go, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And Steven's like, that is not in The Art of War.
I know, but I do love responding with, yes, if you're going to lose, don't. Sun Tzu says.
Oh, man.
Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, eBay Motors. eBay Motors is here for the ride. Remember when you first saw the potential, and then through some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own? With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, exhaust kits, turbochargers, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
Okay, so anyway, originally Lionhearted, he boosted the popularity of the crossbow, then died by it. But with the complete failure of a complete ban, the Second Lateran Council attempted to simply limit it from being used by and against Christians. And if Christians were to use it, they could only use it against heretics, which were basically, in these times, Muslims. I'm not joking. That's what the article was like. Yep.
Well, they would have referred to Muslims there as being not just heretics, like infidels specifically. Yeah. Heretics would be the so there was a whole movement that was going on in southern France at the time that was, oh God, why can't I remember the name of it?
Oh yeah, the article said heretics and infidels, and then in parentheses they're like Muslims, and I was like, dang.
Yes, specifically that's what it'd be. I cannot remember. This is gonna bother me. There was a whole crusade that happened in southern France to wipe out a religious group that was down there. Why can I not remember that? This is gonna bother me.
Don't look at me. I am not the historian.
The Bogolamists? No, it wasn't these. It was the Calvinist? No, Calvinist was for a later time.
Southern France, like Nice?
Hold on. I'm going to look this up. Hold on. Southern
France. Should I keep on going?
Heretic. Yes, do so.
Okay. So shortly after this ruling by the Second Lateran Council, we saw Conrad III, Duke of Swabia, and Holy Roman Emperor, 1138 to 1152.
The Cathars. Catharism. It was the Cathars. That's who I was thinking of.
Are they related to the Catholic?
No.
Okay. What did they do?
They went against the church with their own kind of religious views. And when you have that in the 12th century, which is right around the time, remember they're trying to ban the crossbow? Yeah. It was basically used as an excuse by different French nobles to basically wipe out all the ones in the South.
I want to do a LARP where I can yell, burn the heretics. It'd be really fun to do. I just want to yell that once in like a normal setting, quote quotations, normal setting.
Oh, my Lord.
Anyway, so yes, the Conrad III, Duke of Swabia and Holy Roman Emperor, he forbid the use of crossbows in his empire. However, the only thing the ban did was cause the use of the weapon to spread more and faster. Seeing what was happening with this in Central Europe, we saw the English ban the crossbow as well, but instead of keeping it as a religious law, they made it into a civil war by including it in the Magna Carta of 1215. So as you can probably tell, all of these bans didn't actually stop the use of the crossbow, however, because I'm sure today I could get a crossbow. Can I get a crossbow?
Yeah, you can. You can very easily get a crossbow. In fact, remember, one of the things that they're working on...
Actually, does a crossbow have like a safety lock? Does it have a safety on a crossbow? Maybe just not loading it would be the safety.
Yeah, that's just not loading it.
I don't know. We have a 4-year-old. And I'm a little bit clumsy. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't get a crossbow.
So you want a genuine crossbow, right?
Yeah, historical type. I really wish they made LARP crossbows because I'd be a beast.
They're working on it. There's a thing. So one of the companies that we work with here that I'm looking at doing more stuff with, Fell and Fair, they're in discussion to develop multiple other types of LARP weapons. I'm not going to just reveal all spoilers for it, but that's one of the things that they have talked about that they are interested in doing. It's just Crossbows are way more mechanically complex. So they're trying to figure it out.
I hope they can do it because that would be so fun. Like, can you imagine a LARP where I'm just taking people out with a freaking crossbow?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Oh, you could do a great thing with like Genoese crossbowmen and everything with a Pavise shield and all that.
Yeah. Once I Google what those are, man, I'll be great.
Okay, Gabby. Okay, so moving on from that, we are now finally getting into more of the modern agreements. This is one that I also mentioned in the chemical warfare episode that we did on Patreon, but the Strasbourg Agreement that would come in the 1600s. This was the first international agreement that banned the use of chemical weapons. Or I should specify here, it was very specific. This first international arms treaty that would come into existence right as guns were starting to dominate the battlefield would specifically go and ban poisonous bullets, which is going to sound funny. The problem with bullets were that not only were they very effective on their own from, at killing people, but they could be made more so by adding poisonous substances to them. There were records of people taking bullets, which, mind you, remember this, we're talking just like lead, okay? You could hollow out the lead a little bit or just coat the lead bullet in things like arsenic and other substances. That people would straight up do this.
So I'd imagine it wouldn't kill them immediately. It would cause like a slow, painful...
Agonizing, painful death as it is in their body. Yes, this is also one of the reasons why, remember how people would fire arrows at one another?
Yes.
A common tactic that people would use on arrows is literally dipping the arrows in shit and then afterwards firing them.
Because they didn't have antibiotics. They're like, infect that.
So you get an infection from one of those tainted arrows, you're dead.
That is disgusting but genius. My big thing is the bullets. Did they have the ability to remove bullets?
They did.
Back in the day?
They did. Also, remember that at this point...
Because I just did an episode on surgery. And you said 1600s?
Yes.
Yeah, until like the 19th century. If you had a surgical procedure, you were more likely to die from the procedure.
Correct.
So it was like, oh yeah, I'm getting surgery. Good luck, pal.
Yeah, that's pretty much that is the truth. You were less likely to survive.
So like, yeah, they could remove the bullet, but it might have been better leaving it in.
Yeah, except what would happen here, there was a key problem. Remember what bullets used to be made solidly out of?
Babe, why would I know what bullets used to be made solidly out of?
So when you're talking about shooting someone a lot, you're going to pump them full of...
lead.
Yeah. What happens if there is a lump of lead inside of your body?
Lead poisoning.
There you go.
Just a little lead poisoning as a treat.
Gabby, this is not Rome. You're not sprinkling lead in wine to accentuate the flavor.
No, you're sprinkling lead in bodies to accentuate the death.
Yeah, no, that's literally what they would be doing. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So fast forward several hundred years after that, and technology gets significantly more advanced and also from that, deadly. This is where the story of Henry Dunant comes into play and the start of what we know today as the Geneva Conventions, which I didn't put all this in here, but I'm going to give a quick summary of what this guy did. So in the wars that were going on in like the 1800s, you have this guy who goes to this battlefield and he just sees thousands of people lying on the field dying. They can't do anything about this, right? Remember, this is the mid-1800s. Technology is not great at the time to be able to save people, even as weapons are getting better.
No medics?
They do, but it's not good. So what this guy does is he tries to save as many people as possible. And he partially succeeds, but only in saving some. Thousands more die. And he is so distraught by this that he goes and creates an organization and petitions people to specifically allow his organization to be able to follow and help on battlefields to save people. Can you guess what this organization is?
The Red Cross.
The Red Cross. That is correct. We could do an entire story on the history of the Red Cross for things, but that is specifically where this comes from.
Can we? I'm writing that down right now.
Yeah. Definitely put that in there because the Red Cross has been involved in so many different conflicts since the, again, mid-1800s. Because if I recall correctly from this, and I don't even have it pulled up because that was a whole other note to talk about here. It was like 1856, I think, is when this takes place. And the organization is active by the 1860s. So like literally by the time of the American Civil War. That's what is going on there. So, okay, war still continues through all of this, and this then brings us to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution leads to increasing mechanization of warfare, as well as the rapid advances in the development of firearms, and this leads Tsar Nicholas II of Russia to call together the leaders of 26 other nations for the first Hague Convention or conference in 1899. This conference would lead to the signing of the Hague Convention of 1899 that led to the rules of declaring and conducting warfare, as well as the use of modern weaponry, and also led to the setting up of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So basically, the countries could talk things out more instead of just shooting each other. After this, we have the Second Hague Conference in 1907, and there was supposed to be a third one in 1915. But do you remember what was happening in 1915?
World War I.
Yeah.
Great War. Dun, 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 dun. Sabaton, sorry.
Sabatons, yes. So yeah, that second conference that we're talking about, that was called at the suggestion of U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, so Theodore Roosevelt, in 1904, but that ended up being postponed because of the war that was going on between Russia and Japan, which that would also be a fun one to talk about. I think, did we do that? I may have mentioned it. I don't think I went into full detail on the Russo-Japanese War.
I'm pretty sure it is on the list because
we did the Russian journey, the journey of the Black Sea Fleet.
Yeah, but Chris is going to be writing that because it is on the list.
Okay, so that's going to be one here. The second peace conference was held on the 15th of June to the 18th of October in 1907, and the intent of the conference was to expand upon the original 1899 Hague Convention by modifying some parts and adding new topics. In particular, the 1907 conference had an increased focus on naval warfare because the big fear that all these powers had at this time was, oh God, these naval ships are getting bigger and crazier. Because remember, the dreadnought is now going to be a thing here. Like, this is a time frame in which battleships are becoming a thing.
Dreadnought is also another Sabaton song, just FYI.
Yes.
Same album. Pretty fire to work out to.
Yeah. The British, this is one of the funny, weird stories. I love how they try to do this because it's so, this is like the original nuke story of modern nuclear powers trying to stop other powers from developing nukes themselves, but they're going to keep their own nukes. The British attempted to secure the limitation of armaments, so they wanted to stop people from being able to produce more heavy ships, but these efforts were naturally defeated by other powers, led by Germany, which feared that the British would attempt to stop other nations from getting an actual navy because the British already had the biggest navy in the world at this point.
So that always baffled me because growing up, I don't know if they still do it. They probably still do. But growing up, there was always like, oh, this country has nuclear arms. This country has nuclear armed weapons, and we're trying to regulate it. But the U.S. has a bunch, right?
Yes.
I don't think that's a secret. But why are we out here telling them, nah, bro, actually don't have nuclear weapons? That's a bad thing.
Because if you want to talk about any kind of nations and nuclear arms, who are you going to trust more with a nuclear weapon?
I would not trust anyone with one, preferably no one.
Okay.
Preferably.
How many of these nations are places that potentially have hostile insurgent groups inside of them that have the capability of potentially taking over the government or other spots? Okay. Like, as an example,
yes.
Iran gets nuclear weapons. What happens in the multiple times that the governments of these places have been overthrown and rebel insurgent groups seize large swaths of the country?
Well, they won't have the nuclear codes, so we're fine. Hopefully they have nuclear codes.
They get access to that doesn't mean that they just have nuclear codes. They get access to any of the material. They can repurpose them into something else.
Okay.
Create a dirty bomb.
I get that, I guess. But still, I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit sus to be like, no, we should be the only ones trusted.
Listen, no one is going to care if, like, let's say that right now at this exact moment, okay, Norway developed a nuclear weapons program. No one's going to care.
Okay. So only allies, I guess. We're chill with everybody who's cool with us.
Hell,
I get it. I'm just saying it's a little bit sus.
Literally, you want any of that? Hell no. I'll give you a prime example of this, of something that would also be not as caring. Let's say that God, would I even give it a proper example of this? Right now, geopolitics wise, both the United States and China are trying to court Indonesia. And Indonesia does have some of its own rebel problems and other groups, but it's still regarded as much more stable and a very powerful economy in there. So there is, like, I could see the United States not being concerned about Indonesia developing a nuclear program. If anything, they would want to support Indonesia for a fear of like Chinese influence in the region. You know, like they would want to support them to make sure that Indonesia would be capable of resisting. So that's something you don't really know. There's a lot of different things.
It makes sense. It's so funny and nitpicky. Yep.
Oh, it is. And so we go on that whole topic of nukes, but it's like, yeah, the version of that in 1907 was literally the British trying to stop everyone else from getting a navy because they themselves already had the biggest navy. So many of the rules that were laid down in the Hague Conventions were violated in World War I, to say the least. The German invasion of neutral Luxembourg and Belgium in August of 1914, in order to outflank France, for instance, was a direct violation of Convention 5 of 1907, which states that belligerents must not violate neutral territory and move troops across said territory. Poison gas was introduced and used by all major belligerents throughout the war, and this was in direct violation of, it was Convention 4, Article 2, I think is what it would be this, of 1899, and Convention 4 of 1907, which explicitly forbade the use of, quote, poison or poisoned weapons. And they just did that shit anyway.
Because there was no one who, oh no, we use poisoned or poisoned weapons. We're so badass. No, who's going to arrest us? We'll just use poison or poisoned weapons on them.
Yeah.
I mean, be so for real.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, naval arms control would end up actually happening a short while later with the Washington Conference, but also it was not something that was going to last. Because remember how the big power that was trying to resist Britain and its attempts to limit naval powers was Germany. Germany lost World War I. There was nothing that they could do after that. That means that Britain was effectively going to get its way. So the Washington Conference, officially the International Conference on Naval Limitation, this would be a conference that was held in Washington, D.C. from 1921 to 22 to limit the naval arms race and negotiate Pacific security agreements. There were several major and minor treaty agreements that were drafted and signed, such as the Four-Power Pact, signed by Britain, Japan, France, and the United States. This would stipulate mutual consultation regarding any issue in the Pacific. Remember, they all have colonies there. And affirmed respect for the Pacific territories of signatory nations.
Did they sign this and then like 15 years later be like, haha, no, 10 years later? Right after, they were like, nope.
Remember I told you this thing was not going to last? Yeah.
It really didn't last that long. It was...
Yeah. The other thing that would happen here was the Five-Power Naval Limitation Treaty, which Italy also signed. And this would impose proportional limits on the number of warships that each signatory nation could maintain and mandated some actual disarmament. This would end up lapsing in 1936 when Japan was refused equality with the United States and Britain. Because remember, okay, here's the detail about it. Remember how it's the whole thing of proportion? So it wasn't that they were all allowed to have the same number of warships. No. It was that the United States and Britain were allowed to have the biggest. So it's like, I need to bring this up for the exact proportions. Can you look this up right now? Washington Conference naval proportions. I should have looked this up. If I recall correctly, it was like for every 2 ships that the United States and Britain had, Japan was allowed to have 1 or something like that.
So the conference ultimately adopted the 5-5-3 ratio limits. Since the United States and the United Kingdom maintained navies in both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans to support their colonial territories, the 5-Power Treaty allotted both countries the highest tonnage allowances. The treaty also called on all 5 signatories to stop building capital ships and reduce the size of their navies by scrapping their older ships.
Yeah, okay. So for every 5 ships they had, Japan was allowed to have 3. Japan wanted to go in there and say, hey, I want to also be able to have 5 ships for every 5 that you have. And they're like, no. So Japan withdrew from the treaty.
Also, I got that from history.state.gov, so the government website.
Yeah, so that makes sense with it. So another agreement that regulated the use of submarines and outlawed poison gas in warfare was done there, and a 9-power pact with the Netherlands, Portugal, Belgium, and China would affirm China's sovereignty. What is more interesting about all this is that they straight up tried to outlaw war before World War II ended up happening with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Which, yes, that's Kellogg isn't like, it sounds like, Kellogg cereal, but I'm pretty sure it's a different guy from this. So Kellogg-Briand Pact, this is a thing from August 27th of 1928. This was a multilateral agreement that attempted to eliminate war as an instrument of national policy that could be used by a state. It was easily the most ambitious peacekeeping effort after World War I, and the whole thing is freaking ridiculous. I know I sound dismissive when I say that, but you need to hear all this for just how stupid this thing was. So, okay, hoping to tie in the United States into a system of protective alliances to try and stop any possible resurgence of German aggression, the French foreign minister, Aristide Briand, had first suggested a bilateral non-aggression pact in the spring of 1927. But the U.S. Secretary of State, Frank B. Kellogg, prodded by the American outlawry of war movement and supported by those who were disappointed in the fact that the United States had failed to join the League of Nations.
The League of Legends.
The League of Legends, yes. He proposed that the pact instead be converted from a simple non-aggression pact into a general multilateral treaty, and the French accepted. As a result of the Kellogg proposal, nearly all of the nations in the world eventually would subscribe to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which agreed to renounce war as an instrument of national policy and to settle all international disputes by peaceful means. Signatories allowed themselves a great variety of qualifications and interpretations, though, so the pact would not prohibit, as an example, wars of self-defense or certain military obligations. Like if they had already had a pre-existing agreement to help or protect someone, they would still have to do so. That's fine. Also, the Monroe Doctrine with the United States, that would still be in force, or any other post-war treaties of alliance. The problem is that these conditions, in addition to the fact that the treaty had literally nothing behind it that enforced any of the rules, meant that it was just a giant piece of paper that meant nothing.
So that's the thing, though. Throughout this entire episode, you see people try to enforce these rules. Well, they try to make up these rules, but there's no way to enforce them.
Correct.
The only people, I guess, who stuck to their alliance, like their treaty, were the Greek states.
Yeah.
Like right at the very beginning there. And they were city-states they were tribes at the time, and then they were city-states, and they stuck to it. But also, they didn't say how they enforced it. But I'm assuming they enforced it.
I mean, yeah, I would guess so, but I don't know.
In the first episode, didn't you say the entire city was wiped out because they
yes,
broke their alliance or whatever?
Yeah, well, because it was done by the enemies, yes.
So maybe they enforce it by the threat of just being wiped out. But we can't exactly do that in modern times. So how do we enforce? What is the point of these? Like, how would we enforce the Geneva Conventions? We used it that one time when a bunch of people got punished.
Yeah.
But how would you do that today? Because we see all sorts of crimes happening all the time, war crimes. But
you can't generally do anything until afterwards by capturing. So by virtue of the Geneva Conventions is that if someone has actually been accused of a war crime, or if they've been found guilty of a war crime, they are required by international law to be extradited. But certain people or certain countries have not agreed to all rules. The thing is, this isn't like one giant binding constitution. You can individually agree to or sign different parts of it.
So just like any contract, you could just redline what you don't agree with.
Correct.
Okay. That makes sense. Because I remember the war in Ukraine when that happened at the beginning. People were speculating, oh, they might have used chemical weapons. And then it's like, okay, yeah, but what would anybody be able to do about that? Like, yeah. Because right now, if it was so interesting because they'd report on it, and then what would everyone do? Like, oh, we'll send the world police. Who are those? We don't have those. We need it would never work. But in order to enforce rules like these, you need
an overarching actual authority that would be able to supersede the national sovereignty of a nation.
Right. You need a world government, which would lead to all sorts of stuff because then you'd have a world leader, hypothetically. But then not everyone in the world is even going to vote for that guy. So there's no way to have world police. Whew, y'all.
Correct.
I'm just telling you, this stuff, dicey.
Yep. So that whole thing was dumb. But still, though, there would be another attempt that would be trying to stop armed conflict by disarming nations in the early 1930s, which, as you can imagine, considering what would come afterwards, was a complete failure. Okay, so all that was happening with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right? And then you have the World Disarmament Conference. which was an international conference of states held in Geneva, Switzerland between February of 1932 and November of 1934 to accomplish disarmament in accordance with the Covenant of the League of Nations. This is something that was attended by 61 states, most of which were members of the League of Nations, but also the USSR and the United States would also attend. This was specifically aimed to reduce arms across the globe. The conference was organized and campaigned for by the League of Nations, with the main objective being to avoid another world war. The conference's goals included defining aggressively offensive weapons, reasonable defensive weapons, abolishing submarines, aviation, and heavy-duty tanks, and limiting land forces. And at first, progress towards disarmament was slowed after World War I, chiefly by disagreements among the victorious powers. But as the years went by without any kind of result, the question of German armaments, that became more and more of a problem. See, if you remember looking at what happened to Germany after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles neutered Germany completely. It really cut them down.
What a way to word that.
Oh, no, it did. If you're talking about removing their capabilities, it straight up neutered them. They were only allowed to have a standing army of 100,000 men. They weren't allowed to have more than 7 divisions. They weren't allowed to have, there was a whole bunch of limitations, requirements on them. Like they straight up could not do anything. In fact, there was a challenge. I saw a guy on YouTube do one of these. You know how I play Hearts of Iron 4? He's like, I'm going to play Germany using the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. Like, I'm only allowed to have this, which I found to be an interesting concept. I may try that for my own attempt here at some point in the future, but that's an interesting thing itself. This was a big problem for Germany as their attitude changed over time, geopolitically speaking. See, the issue that the Germans did not like here is that they were supposed to, as time would go on, become equal partners, like in the League of Nations. They were supposed to be contributing members to society, so to speak. And they were specifically being forbidden from doing any of that by virtue of the treaty. So German diplomats, at least in public, were trying to get equality of status based on the reduction of victorious powers. What that means is that they were going, okay, hey, if we're all supposed to be disarming, then that means the Treaty of Versailles that we are subject to that limits our army, if we want to be equal, you all need to do that too. You also reduce yourselves, because the goal of this is to reduce weapons, right? To reduce conflict. We want to get rid of this stuff. So you all should limit yourselves too.
Smart. Wait, did others do that?
No.
Okay, good.
No, they obviously didn't. They definitely did not do that. The other alternative thing that many Germans wanted was to revoke the Treaty of Versailles and say, okay, well, you all don't have to disarm yourself, but we need to be able to arm ourselves again so that we are equal. So that way all the powers are sitting on equal footing.
Question. Do diplomats know about the shady business that their government
Some of it, yeah. Yeah, it depends.
And they still have to go out there and just do diplomacy?
It's called being diplomatic, yeah.
Do you think I'd be a good diplomat?
Sometimes, yes. But I also think that out of spite, you would potentially reveal something just because someone pissed you off.
No, I feel like, I say this a lot. I'm like, oh, when I'm angry, I'm not very good with my words. If somebody pisses me off, I would cuss them out. And then I guess the negotiations would go to shit.
You're a great diplomat right until you cause a diplomatic incident.
Yeah, literally. I'd be so good and so calm, and someone would say the wrong thing to me and it'd be game over. Full on war.
Yeah.
I would call out the war. And then the president of whatever country would be like, ma'am, you do not have the ability to do that.
To be able to do that.
And I'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry. They're shooting at you. Good luck.
As you can imagine from this scenario, though, that's going to create more problems, Gabby.
No, they're fine. They were fine. I mean, World War II happened, but then after that, it was a lot after that. It was, Germany's pretty chill now, I think. We were there the other day. They were, well, no, actually, because there was protest. Okay, so baseline, they will be okay for a little bit there. Were they okay?
Here's the funny thing.
I'm trying to.
So at the time that these negotiations are going down, it's 1932 to 1934. Do you know what happened in that time period?
A lot.
That's when the Nazis got elected into power.
Yep.
Yeah.
So they weren't fine, but
Yeah.
who's really fine? How do we define okay?
And the problem was in this case is that when the Nazis were being elected, so the world powers were already seeing them make ground, like to make progress within the state. And they're like, okay, this is a problem. We're definitely not going to disarm ourselves because we can see that this is happening in Germany. It wasn't a surprise what was going on. They were seeing what was happening in Germany and they didn't want to disarm themselves by virtue of what if something happens here?
Well, they weren't wrong, but that brings me to another really important question. Is that why governments they intervene in other countries' elections if they see something like that going awry?
They can be very hostile, yes. It's a matter of self-preservation.
So they just say, screw it, and they go mess with someone's election?
Yes. Literally, yes.
Were they messing with elections back then, or did they start because of it?
Oh, when they occurred? Yeah. Are you kidding me? Remember the whole thing when we talked about papal elections and what would happen where all the bribery would occur of different countries trying to get their elected person in?
I mean, in modern times, like more modern times. Like,
I mean, it's a lot more subterfuge that's involved now, but yes, there's still all kinds of influence. Hell, one of the things is that even what we talked about with Haiti, right? So though it wasn't necessarily interference in this regard, Ariel Henry, who took over after Moise died, was assassinated.
Yeah.
And obviously he's now resigned, but instead of other countries going against him, the United States and others threw their power behind trying to support him. And they did that, interfering in Haitian sovereignty from that regard to try and give a kind of stable government, which didn't work.
To give legitimacy.
Yeah, give legitimate. I mean, that was the big thing, to give legitimacy. No direct interference could actually happen there. And there wasn't like any elections could be interfered with because guess what?
They didn't
held
have
no
any
elections.
Smart move if you want to rule a country forever.
But they wanted it to be at least a little bit more stable. So yeah, stuff still happens.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen here.
No. So the Nazis were coming into power. A deadlock happens. They end up not going through with any of the disarmament stuff. And then by the time that 1934 comes around, or when it sets up to resume in 1933, that Hitler, by this point, has become Chancellor of Germany. And in the atmosphere of everything that was going on, no one wanted to disarm themselves, naturally. And any prospect that the new Nazi regime might be drawn to a collective security agreement, this disappeared on October 14th, 1933, because Hitler, finding that the Entente powers had proposed to maintain the restrictions of the peace treaty of Versailles for another 4 years, he instead seized the occasion to make a massive withdrawal from the conference of the League, from the League, and from then on, Germany was openly rearming instead of secretly rearming, which it had been doing for years.
Okay. So do you think that I don't think the Nazi Party, this is a thought experiment and not at all part of the podcast. You guys can stop if you don't want to hear it. But would the Nazi Party have gained as much power had they not been so harshly punished after World War I?
No.
So more than likely we would not have seen a World War II.
They still would have achieved a degree of power from like irredentism, I think is what it is, where it's like they want to be able to reclaim some of their past glory, but they would not have received nearly as much problem because one of the big heavy-handed actions that led to outside interference that really pissed off a lot of people was the French occupation of the Rhine. So the Rhineland and that whole territory here that was the industrial heartland of Germany, France occupied it for a time in order to recoup losses, in order to get back the debt that had been incurred, so to speak. That pissed off a lot of people, and it really upset the local population and turned them against them. You couple this with all of the fact that like the economy, the money, all of it was worthless, right? Everything was going to chaos. And one of the big reasons that the Nazis were able to take power in the first place is actually because of the communists. So within Germany at this time, you had radical right-wing groups and you had radical left-wing groups. And the radical communist groups were the first groups to appear that were essentially creating chaos in the city, trying to overthrow different parts of the government, riots, like workers' rights, whatever you want to think of, they were doing this. And they were terrorizing the population and the government. And so the right-wing groups rose out specifically as a reaction to, well, I mean, they were already there, but they became popular as a direct reaction to these groups, which is where you saw actual street fights between miniature armies of communists and Nazis and other affiliated groups in the streets. Because there actually could have been not a Nazi Germany. We could have had a communist Germany happen.
Interesting.
Yeah, that is a real historical possibility that could have occurred.
Do you think because of what happened there that it would hold back other nations from potentially placing such harsh punishments on a country that would start a war?
That is precisely what happened afterwards. After World War II, there was multiple plans to what to do with Germany afterwards, with some of them being very harsh. I mean, we're talking one of the plans was to almost knock Germany back to the Stone Age. It would have involved destroying every single factory in Germany to completely remove its industrial capabilities, to revert it to an agrarian style economy, so that it would never be able to create tools of war again.
Wow, that's a bit harsh.
That was one of the proposals. But they didn't do this because it was predicted that in destroying any of its industrial capability, it would lead to famine that would kill literally millions of more people and create more problems.
Yeah. And also a grudge that would last generations after generations after generations until one day we'd be right back there.
Yep. So you see what it is that I'm talking about.
So now they think a little bit more carefully before all of those sanctions and whatnot.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. They have to be more careful. There always needs to be a way out, so to speak. You can't just... The problem is that if you go and destroy a country now, that just creates instability that leads to other countries. It's always a ripple effect. Like no one, even with what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, you do not want Russia to collapse. You don't want this.
Because then everyone in their country is in a worse spot. So then you can have something worse arise out of it.
Mass migration, chaos that spreads to surrounding border states, and then that creates compounding effects.
I've always wondered why people play so nicely during war nowadays with the fine balance, you know?
Yeah, because the stakes are so much worse now than they were before.
Yeah, it's horrible, but also they're not as brutal as they could be. So it's always been interesting. And this has been eye-opening for someone like me who did not study international relations.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So anyway, yeah, of course, World War II happens, and it's obviously awful. And then fast forward a little bit more time, and in 1949, there was an international conference of diplomats that would go and build on earlier treaties for the protection of war victims, revising and updating them into 4 new conventions comprising 429 articles of law, known as the Geneva Conventions of August 12th, 1949. This is when people are referring to the Geneva Conventions, they're referring to specifically this, usually. The additional protocols of 1977 and 2005 would supplement the Geneva Conventions, and the Geneva Conventions apply in all cases of declared war or in any other armed conflict between nations. They also apply in cases where a nation is partially or totally occupied by soldiers of another nation, even when there is no armed resistance to that occupation. Nations that ratify the Geneva Conventions must abide by certain humanitarian principles and impose legal sanctions against those who violate them. Ratifying nations must, quote, enact any legislation necessary to provide effective penal sanctions for persons committing or ordering to be committed any of the grave breaches of the conventions. So, yeah, essentially, everyone now, when any kind of conflict or anything breaks out, gets accused of a war crime or all these varying things or of violating Geneva Conventions. And this is where things get really murky. In fact, I'm not going to bring up for anything for the geopolitics of today or other conflicts that are going on, but I will say this. I will say this right now, and you can apply it to basically any conflict across the world because all of this is truth. When people declare and say like, oh, isn't that a violation? Isn't this thing a violation of the Geneva Conventions? Genuinely go and look into it because they're so specific in their rules, restrictions, and requirements for what classifies as something that many of the things that we may think of as having been like, oh, this totally would be, is not. Especially based on the rules and limitations of a conflict that is currently ongoing. But with that, that's really the end because I wanted to go do a whole thing on nuclear proliferation, but at this point, I think this is like an hour and a half.
So let's do nuclear proliferation. I'll add it to the list.
Oh, we'll add nukes to the list. Great. But yes, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. My friends, thank you very much for listening. I apologize if you hear any coughing or scratchiness of my voice or anything over the course of this. Even now, I can feel the rattling in my chest as I'm speaking. I'm going to have to end things here today, but thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.
Bye.